If you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, it would be greatly appreciated if you could give the podcast a 5-star rating. This helps other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you. This is Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism. I'm your host, Andrew Pludger, and I'm a survivor of Bob Jones University. BJU is a fundamentalist college with its roots in white supremacy and is known for its culture of indoctrination, conformity, and control. Its influence extends beyond its campus, impacting Christian schooling, politics, biblical counseling, and evangelical Christianity. The school serves as a hub for churches, schools, and camps, and these institutions perpetrate its abusive teachings and practices. This show explores these areas of influence and amplifies the stories of those who have been impacted by Bob Jones University. This is Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism. Hello, everyone. I am really excited for you all to hear this episode because I recorded it with my good friend Eric Skwarczynski, and he is the host of the Preacher Boys podcast, and you saw him in the Let Us Pray documentary on Max. But I had him come on because I really want to have guests on the show that are well versed in areas that relate to fundamentalism and Bob Jones University. And one thing that I'm seeing a lot of is I'm interviewing a lot of survivors from Bob Jones churches that are specifically independent fundamental Baptist. And I thought it's so important for people to understand the independent fundamental Baptist movement because, a lot of survivors, they come on and they mention, yes, I was in an IFB church. And I feel like, I don't expect IFB survivors to know all of it. Like, it is a lot to dig into. It is a lot to understand and unpack. And I don't expect survivors to know all the ins and outs of it. But I wanted to have Eric on because I want people, when they hear IFB, I want them to really understand what it's all about and just the harm of this awful movement. And Eric, he has a Preacher Boys podcast. I think it's 4 years old now, and I think over 300 episodes now of him exposing the movement. And I use the term movement very lightly. He digs into the history, the teachings, the dynamics of recruitment, and he calls it out for what it really is. The IFB, or Independent Fundamental Baptist Movement, is a cult. And I loved having him on because we're both survivors of this movement, and we both share some of our own experiences or our own insights after getting out of it and living our own lives. But please enjoy this episode with Eric Skwarczynski on the Independent Fundamental Baptist Movement. Hello, everyone. I am so excited to have Eric Skwarczynski on the show today, and you heard him on Surviving BJU, and I know several other listeners have gone over to his podcast, Preacher Boys, which exposes the independent fundamental Baptist movement, and you also probably know him from the documentary on Max, Let Us Pray, a ministry of scandals. But thank you so much, Eric, for being willing to take time out of, I know, your very busy schedule to talk on the show today.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. And it's amazing how many of these stories keep coming up over and over again that sends you into a flurry on random Thursdays. Let me put this story together. So, yeah, I'm excited to talk a little bit about Bob Jones, the independent Baptist world in general.
Of course. And then anything that I didn't mention, if you want to do a more in-depth introduction of yourself.
Yeah. So my name is Eric Skwarczynski. I'm the host of the Preacher Boys podcast. I started in January of 2020, exposing abuse within independent fundamental Baptist churches, and have been doing that ever since. And really now have broadened the horizon a bit to talk about just fundamentalism in general and how that affects how people operate, using the IFB as my starting point into that discussion. So I've talked to people like Shalise Ansola from, the ex-Mormon community. I've talked to people like Alice Gretchen, who's a former Pentecostal and was part of like Youth with the Mission and things like that. And really what I've noticed over the years is that all of these stories, whether you're talking to someone from Bob Jones or from, whether you're talking to someone from Pensacola or from Mormon groups, like all these fundamentalist religious groups really act the same way. It's all about control, power, and manipulation. And so for the last several years, I've just dedicated a huge chunk of time to exposing that, understanding how it works so we can avoid it moving forward as survivors of these groups, and really just to take the microphone from the people that have had it and give it to people that haven't historically in these churches. So that's pretty much what I do. But you mentioned, Let Us Pray in the podcast, and those are the two other things I would point people to.
Of course, thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, it's interesting because we had a conversation before about our podcast. We were talking about the similarities between what I'm doing with Beyond BJU and your kind of different direction with Preacher Boys. And it is interesting the different things that it influences that you wouldn't necessarily think of. I had a conversation with Dr. Camille Lewis, and she talked about some influence of Mormonism on complementarianism theology that's
Yeah.
very much throughout IFB and Bob Jones and just fundamentalism. And I'm like, oh, I would have never known that. And yeah, it is good to hear these stories from people from different backgrounds of these different high control groups or different cults because the dynamics are the same. The beliefs and might differ in some areas and in other areas maybe not, and it's just labeled differently, different names for the same exact thing. But I think you begin to see the light and understand and see the connections. It's great because it makes people feel less alone, and I think also validates their experiences. Also makes me realize, oh, I'm not crazy. Like this is a real issue, or oh, other people have gone through this. But I absolutely love that you have exposed and are still exposing the independent fundamental Baptist movement. And I think a friend told me about you. I think it was like 2 years ago, and they were like, "Do you know someone's exposing the independent fundamental Baptist movement in a podcast?" And I was like, "No, please tell me about this." And then I ended up going on your show. Yeah, I think 2 years ago, and that was a really great experience. But I really wanted you to really help people understand the independent fundamental Baptist movement to give them an overview because Bob Jones University has their camp of IFB. Pensacola has their camp of IFB. Hiles Anderson has their camp of IFB. So really, just I know people who are going to listen to this podcast, they may have never heard about the independent fundamental Baptist movement. So could you tell me what that is? So kind of digging into the history, the reasons for starting, and digging into the rules and teachings and the culture.
Yeah. I mean, the IFB really, depending on which IFB pastor you talk to, you're going to get varied versions of the history of them. And for those who are really interested and want to really nerd out, I'll send you a link, but I did a 2-part history of the IFB that's about 4 hours, I think, altogether with a friend of mine who is a Presbyterian, actually. And he goes into levels that I could never hope to retain and dives deep into the real origins of this group. But really, you can trace the IFB back to a man named J. Frank Norris back in the 20s. And there's a great book on him called The Shooting Salvationist that kind of breaks down his beliefs. He was just a wacky dude. There's a lot of stories connected to him that are, involve murder and all these different things. But he was kind of a starter pistol for the movement itself, this idea of being unto yourself as a church. But I always start my conversations about the IFB with Jack Hyles. And, a lot of IFB people get upset with that because they'll go, he didn't start it. It was way before him. There was decades before him. There were other churches. And yes, that is true. There were other IFB churches that existed, but I always say there were other carnivals that existed before, Walt Disney started Disneyland. It's a hugely different thing. He took something that existed and made it a brand unto itself. And so if we're talking about independent fundamental Baptist churches, you can go back to the 20s. You can go back to probably earlier than that. When you want to talk about the IFB, I would say it starts with Jack Hyles and his existence in First Baptist Church of Hammond. I think he really took it and made it something that caught the attention of not just fundamentalists and didn't just start a whole new swath of churches in that realm, but it caught the attention of just the culture in general and evangelicalism in general, because they were seeing the world's largest Sunday school. They were seeing these massive bus route campaigns. They were seeing, at the time, one of the largest megachurches in the country, which people tend to forget. And so that really is the point where I think the movement as it stands as a brand really started.
And so could you dig into a lot of the rules and the teachings and really what differs it from other regular Baptist churches?
Yeah. So I always say it's take the Southern Baptist Church and really dial it up to 11. There's 1950s Christianity personified in a lot of ways. And I'll go into the theology side, but just on the surface, I think when people look at these churches, it looks like the church grandma described going to. The women in the dresses below the knee, the men in these nice suits with the comb overs, the fire and brimstone preaching. The aesthetic is something that I think it's got a real draw to it in American culture because it has that Norman Rockwell feel to it. We're going to go down to the church house and then go to lunch after. And then I think for others now, it's become this thing that feels very reminiscent of what we see in churches like the Mormon Church. It feels very Stepford Wives-esque. So depending on how you read it, it's either going to be very off-putting or very alluring, depending on what your context going into it is. We can look at the exterior, but we also need to look at the theology, which I think gets left out in these conversations because we just go, these jean skirts look funny, and we miss some of the things that power the movement itself. At the heart of independent fundamental Baptist churches is this doctrine of separation, this idea that we need to be different than the world. And anybody who grew up in independent fundamental Baptist circles would hear verses, you're a peculiar people. And that was really the banner cry of the movement, is how do we look different from the world? And so as much as they claim to be fundamentalists that stand on timeless truths, the entire religion is extremely reactionary to culture. It is, what is the culture doing and how do we do everything opposite of that? And that approach to it is what has led them in some very bizarre positions over the years. Everything they've done has been a reaction to what is the secular world doing, the liberal world doing. If you listen to Jack Hyles' sermon, Sunday's Coming, which actually might be a good audio snippet to slip in here.
Enjoy yourself, rock music crowd. Enjoy your dirty rock concerts. Enjoy your nudity. Enjoy your sensuous literature, your sensuous words and sensuous verse and sensuous music. Enjoy your adulterous singing and your filth and garbage and rot. Live it up, Rolling Stones. Stone not cut out without hands will have his day before long. Sunday's going to come. Enjoy yourself, Madonna. This is your hour. Enjoy yourself, Prince. This is your hour. Enjoy yourself, Michael Jackson. This is your hour. And enjoy yourself, teenagers scattered across this building that are all wrapped up in the rock philosophy. And enjoy yourself. Live it up. Listen to all of it you can. This is your hour and the hour of the power of darkness. But praise God, Sunday morning's going to come.
So I wanted to add in here, so when I was searching for this sermon online, Sunday is Coming, I found a YouTube video of the sermon, and it was very jarring to me because I started listening to it, and he mentions Bobby Robertson, which was the IFB pastor I grew up under. As I'm watching the video, I'm realizing this sermon is happening at the IFB church cult I grew up in. And Jack Hiles was then bragging about how him and Bobby were good friends, and I was just like, okay, oof, this hits too close to home. But oh my gosh, but again, I think it really communicates what Eric will be talking about in this episode and throughout of how all these pastors are buddies together and protect one another, and they all go around visiting each other's churches, and they're independent when it's convenient, but they're really united underneath it, all these different churches. But let's continue to listen to Eric Skwarczynski's interview.
It's essentially 45 minutes of him naming rock groups, churches, leaders in the church, and saying, you've had your day, but Sunday's coming. Like Jesus is coming back, and it's going to look like, us. And so this reactionary theology led them to some interesting places. But there's quite a few things. I mean, they believe in a literal interpretation of the King James Bible as being the inspired, preserved Word of God. That is their textbook for life. They believe in Baptistic theology, so they believe in immersion, baptism. They believe in, literal interpretation of every story in the Bible. So, which is similar to a lot of evangelicals, but 6,000-year-old earth, fill in the blank, all these different stories, they would hold to a literal translation as long as it comes from the King James Bible itself. And then beyond that, there's strict purity culture that goes, women are temptresses, men are in this power structure. They hold to a very staunch patriarchal view of the home. All of the worst traits that you'll see in the most extreme churches, I'm happy to drill deep onto any of those. But at a 10,000-foot view, I would say the key elements of the IFB are control, patriarchal structure within the home and the church itself, and a literal interpretation. And I want to be clear on that, because when you get into conversations with theologians and professors of biblical history, when you get into a literal interpretation of the Bible, at some point you have to say, this is my interpretation of the Bible. So I would say the historic Baptist interpretations of the Bible, they propagate over time. But there is no serious, biblical historians in the IFB world that are digging through to see, what does this mean? It's all parroting what has come before. And so that tradition has really carried them through. But that's a lot. So if there's anywhere you want me to drill down, I'm happy to. But I wanted to hit a couple of those key points.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, no, I think there are some things I want to say, because I think people who know me, they know I grew up in the independent fundamental Baptist movement in North Carolina. And it's interesting, as I talked about it more and more, I've kind of started in my own mind seeing some of those core things. And I think looking back, like fear and punishment and obedience are something that they focus on so much. And I saw someone on Facebook somewhere explaining the IFB to someone, and they were like, yeah, they have some of the essential things of Christianity that a lot of evangelical people agree on, but they add on a lot of legalism and a lot of rules. And it's, if you truly believe, you're going to look and act exactly like us. There's going to be no difference. And it just down to these like little rules of, oh, like you're not going to go to the movie theater. Oh, you're going to dress like this. Oh, you're not going to have these books. Oh, you're not going to hang around people who do this. I think a question I have for you, and I heard you on TikTok I think it was for the investigation, on the Investigation Discovery account, you talked about what it was like what would happen to someone's life when they got involved in a church, like all the different. So could you explain, when someone joins these kinds of churches, what happens? How does their life change?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like any cultish group, which I would say, again, the movement as a whole, I would define as a cult. I would not say, there's always outliers, right? I think there's churches that are truly independent that I think are pastored by well-intentioned people. But I would say that's the exception, not the rule. I think the movement as itself and followed to the T is cults. So I'm going to use the word cult. I know it's a hot button word, but it's a lot faster than me couching that statement every time I say it. Speaking to the cult versions of these churches. I would say it's like any cult in terms of nobody says, hey, I'm going to go join a cult. Like people are obviously drawn to something. And I mentioned some of that, which is aesthetically, these churches look very safe. It looks like 1950s Norman Rockwell, grandma church house, like it feels familiar, even as someone who hasn't been in it, while also feeling strange because it's so countercultural. And so, you see people that send their kids to the churches to go to Sunday school. The parents start attending, and IFB churches are very heavy on going out and doing what they call soul winning, which is inviting people to church, trying to get them to accept Christ and then join the church quickly. And they are very non-discriminatory in the way that they approach people who are prospects for the church. So whether you are black, white, gay, straight, addicted to drugs, single mom, like married, have a bunch of kids, have no kids, are old, young, it doesn't matter. Whether you are wearing a t-shirt and shorts or you're a girl wearing whatever, they don't care. They have no interest in discussing any of that really with you at your door. They're going to invite you and say, all are welcome. Come visit our church. We're doing Friend Sunday. I'd love for you to be my friend at the church. We're doing Roundup Sunday. Have your kids come ride horses at the church, and we're going to have a quick message and a great bite to eat after. And they'll do these huge events where they bring everybody in. And during that service, they will lead you in a salvation prayer and say, anyone who, wants to go to heaven, raise your hand, close your eyes, raise your hand, repeat this prayer after me. And it gives some version of the sinner's prayer, which is, Jesus, I know I'm a sinner. I'd be lost without you. I'm asking you now to come into my heart, forgive me of my sins. And that's pretty much it. Amen. Now you're a Christian. Praise the Lord. Who made a decision? What happens then is those people will typically fill out a visitor's card, or in a smaller church, they'll go to the pastor or an assistant pastor or deacon and share that they made that decision. What starts happening from then is they increasingly become more discriminatory, which is, hey, great, now you're a believer. And so one of these things is going to happen. You're going to join our discipleship class. You're going to meet with one of us one-on-one for the next couple of weeks. We're going to start talking to you about getting baptized, about becoming a member. And so over the next couple of weeks, they'll start going into the doctrine of the church itself. So the girl that was wearing shorts and a tank top when they were at the door saying, we'd love to have you, come as you are, is being told, now listen, you're a Christian. I know you didn't know this, but you can't wear that stuff anymore. Here, you know what? Actually, one of our church ladies just went and bought you some clothes that would be a better fit. I saw this happen in the church I grew up in. For those that would say I'm exaggerating, we had a kid who was what they say, a bus kid that got sent on the church bus to church every week. And he became a Christian. And like the next week, they went out and bought him a suit, because he didn't have a suit. And so that stuff will start happening. Hey, we noticed that you brought with you the Bible your grandma had given you, but that's a New Living Translation. Here's a King James Bible. For someone who's a single mom, it's like, hey, you obviously can't be too involved in some of these ministries, but we'd love to have you here. For someone who's gay, there's a whole nother layer of things that are, look, we know that you accepted Christ. That means that you are no longer living this lifestyle. So here, let's start working through this. Let's find you a girl, like that. This kind of process starts breaking down. And what happens is the group that you joined that looked like it accepted everybody, that looked like it was open to anyone in the community, you start going down this funnel and you start realizing that, okay, the goalposts are moving. Like at first it was, hey, show up. We'd love to have you. And then it was, we'd love to have you if you're wearing these clothes. Hey, we'd love to have you if you're also wearing, if you're also reading this Bible. Hey, we'd love to have you if you were married. Hey, we'd love to have you if you kind of kept it hush that you were married and you had kids and now your husband's not in the picture. Hey, we'd love to have you, but you need to join our choir. Hey, we'd love to have you, but you need to join. And if that sounds frustrating to listen to, imagine that spread out over a year or 2-year period as you start looking back and going, the person I used to be, you start looking back and going, okay, I'm not that person. But the way that you're taught and trained makes you go, well, this is my testimony now. I used to be this normal person. Now I'm a peculiar person who is put in this church. And because my clothes look like theirs, my Bible looks like theirs, my environment is theirs, my friends all go here, you find yourself with no contact to people with different perspectives outside that world. So your coworkers start becoming enemies or prospects, one of the two, depending on how open they are. Your family that is questioning why you go to the weird church on the corner starts becoming more distant, and you become more and more enwrapped in this church to the point where you're now attending 3 times a week. Your kids are joining the Christian school and they're there 5 days a week. And then Saturday, you're getting in a van and passing out flyers to invite people to church. And so it's really this vicious kind of MLM cycle of, hey, let me go find new prospects to find new prospects to find new prospects. And all the while, I'm becoming more and more engaged in the church itself, to where the idea of leaving feels like I'd be leaving my entire life behind, which is what you did when you joined, but it was just a much slower process than what leaving is.
Wow, that was amazing. I was getting chills because I'm like, you were just describing it so well. And it's something like I've thought about in my own upbringing because I'm like, oh, I was born into this. I remember passing out tracts. I'm like, and I've been lately thinking, what is the process of someone who then is recruited, not born into it? And you just explained it very well. Again, it's that love bombing. Oh, we had this community, all these great things for you. And then the goalposts are moved, and it's a common manipulation tactic where, once you get someone to make one commitment, it's easier to get them to make so many more. And again, like you said, 1 or 2 year period, it just, you kind of forget who you were before that change that happens.
I mean, it's a whole nother layer too for those born into it. I just described someone with a 2-year process that happens after they're a convert. I mean, imagine someone who, like myself, is born into it and is being taught from the time they can understand anything that there is this spiritual war going on. You're in the Lord's army. You're this, like, and you're being taught all those things. And on top of that, being constantly told you're not like the world. You're going and knocking. I knocked. Now the city has grown, but at a time, I think I could have honestly said I've knocked on every door in our community at some point through my life. And so I'm being told we have the answers. All of these people don't. All of these people are a threat. All of these people are, you know, in need of becoming like us. They would say in need of a savior, which meant they're in need of a suit, tie, and King James Bible to come join our church. And that perspective is so hardwired into your brain if you grow up in these environments. And you can become a hardcore believer. I talked to someone the other day who joined a church when they were in their 30s and started going down the funnel. But to be starting at a young age is a really crazy thing to unpack and disentangle from what is me and what is them and who am I, because I was so entrenched in this from day one that the default kind of hum in my operating system says you are an independent fundamental King James only gravy slopping, tribulation believing Baptist, whatever that long list of phrases they'd love to say. So yeah, it's a trip, for lack of
Yeah.
a better word.
Yeah, most definitely. And it's interesting because what I've noticed with people who, like me and like you, who were born into it, and people have asked me, they're like, how did you get out of that? How do you overcome that indoctrination? Like, how does that happen? And it's something I'm still unpacking a lot of in therapy and like writing. But I've noticed a lot of people, there's something about you that makes you different in this binary system. And it just doesn't exactly, like, you don't fit right into it. And it
Mm.
becomes a frustration. And you conform, it doesn't work. And so eventually you have to get to the point to question it to save yourself, or an experience happens. I know with
Yeah.
you, an experience happened, that perspective on it, and you're like, oh, I thought we were this, but now I see something that is doesn't make sense to me, or this isn't in line with what I thought that we were, and then the cards fall apart. I've
Yeah.
also heard stories of people like they actually did have some interaction with people on the outside, and when they had a good experience, and they're like, oh, well, I was told that these people were evil and awful, but these are actually good people. I wonder what else. And that's why one of the reasons they're so separatist and they really want you isolated is they
Yeah.
don't want that positive contact with the outside world at all. So they can control your life. And oh my gosh, like the Christian schooling, that's another aspect. Either they have the church I grew up in, they had a Christian school. My parents thought it was bad, so they homeschooled me and my brothers. We were too good for the church's Christian school. But oof, yes. And then of course another part is when people get involved, you're usually told if you don't give 10% of your income, you're not going to be blessed. That was another thing. From a young age, I had to give 10% of my $5 allowance from a young age. That indoctrination. I look back and I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. That's so
Yeah.
ridiculous. But let's see here. So I think maybe something I want to dig a little bit more into with the history for the specific reasons of starting it. It was a reaction to modernism, wasn't it? Why they started?
Yes. So a lot of, and again, this depends on which version you talk to. If you talk to someone in the IFB, like what I had always heard growing up was it was a reaction to liberalism in the SBC, which is the Southern Baptist Convention. This is not true. The Southern Baptist Convention was not the movement that was really being splintered off from. It was actually, and I'm going to blank on it now, there was another Baptist denomination that was fairly large early on that J. Frank Norris separated from. Later on, there was a lot of contention with the Southern Baptist Convention over a lot of different topics, things like Bible translations, women being ordained was a major point of contention. And honestly, it's kind of funny now because the Southern Baptist Convention back then sounded a lot more rad than the Southern Baptist Convention as it stands now. It's like we were fighting the fight for different Bible translations and women to have some voice in the church. What happened to that spirit? But yeah, I mean, a lot of it was reaction to just liberalism in the culture, evangelicalism at large. We can debate whether it was largely the Southern Baptist or American Baptist or evangelicals in general. And even a lot of Baptist pastors I've spoken to over the years have given me a variety of reasons that the independent Baptists are the more supreme church. But ultimately, like I said, everything has been reactionary. And so you would see these alliances that would form and then they would split off. So you would see a Jack Hyles that would turn on a very fundamentalist pastor like a John MacArthur over topics like Bible translations, or in the case of John MacArthur and Jack Hyles, the idea of whether or not the blood that atones for our sins is a literal or figurative message in Scripture. And so little theological nuances like that would become major points in sermons. John MacArthur taught that when Christ was crucified as the atonement for sins of mankind, that when the Bible talks about blood on the mercy seat in heaven, that is just a figurative statement of justice for salvation. Ultimately, I don't think, and I'm not a believer currently, but I don't think even at the time that I never saw that as mattering too much, because the essence of salvation was faith in Christ and his work. It wasn't in, I believe in this blood type or this specific level of real blood versus fill in the blank. And so it would be the same thing as believing in the cross itself versus the sacrifice. It seemed like a tertiary issue to not be messed with. And Hyles believed that it was literal mercy seat with literal blood of Christ on it in heaven. So you're hearing this and you're going, probably, if you're like anybody else, okay, that just sounds like an interesting, different interpretation of what that passage means. A figure who's a fundamentalist like Jack Hyles literally said from the pulpit, I hope that when I die and go to heaven, that I see John MacArthur there so I can walk him up to the mercy seat and rub his nose in the blood of Christ on the mercy seat. Which, if you're a Christian, you're going, that's incredibly blasphemous sounding, because who on earth would say that? If you're anybody else, you go, that's really gross and scary. This guy sounds unhinged. Both of those takes are probably correct. But that's the kind of stuff that you'd see happen constantly, was like, there's this issue, and here we got to go hardcore in this other direction. And to a variety of topics, like preaching against churches that didn't run bus ministries, preaching against churches that didn't use the same Bible, like I've mentioned. And again, If you think it's annoying how many times I've said, oh, they would talk about if you didn't use the right translation of the Bible, imagine hearing that for 20 plus years, where that's a talking point in every sermon, every message, every conference you go to. And so everything was a reaction to perceived liberalism. But I think ultimately, and this is where we get into the deeper conversation, do I believe that Jack Hyles truly believed those things? I don't. And again, this is where this is my opinion, big disclaimer, because who knows? Who can judge a man's heart? Maybe he did truly have these weird beliefs. But ultimately, I believe that Jack Hyles used these things as distractions from the, for lack of a better term, the beam in his own eye when it came to addressing these splinters in the eyes of others. Like, he would point out the blood on the mercy seat and make a whole sermon about it. But yet Jack Hyles was someone who, as a major name in the IFB, was constantly being exposed with major scandals involving affairs, fraud, financial things, like covering for his children's own action. It was a look at this, don't look at me too closely. And I think that's something that, you'll see a lot in
The projecting
right.
on other people. Yeah.
Yeah, and totally like different thing. For example, like the gay scare, like you would hear a lot more pastors. I always said this even when I was in religion itself, and I would say it more as a call for people to broaden their horizons of their preaching. But the two most common things you'll hear about in Baptist churches, at least in the time I was growing up, was the gay agenda and abortion. Those were the two biggest perceived threats within the IFB world. Like, these are the two big issues. What you didn't hear preached about as much was extramarital affairs, pornography. They would be brought up. Don't let someone pull that out of context and say, oh, he said we never talked about it. We certainly did. Here's the sermon. They talked about porn and adultery all the time, but it paled in comparison. Like, the quote unquote sins that a heterosexual white pastor struggled with were very different than the sins that they would preach about to the congregation. Gluttony is the example that gets brought up all the time. The amount of times that you would see a pastor who is 300 pounds, 400 pounds, 500 pounds, standing in the pulpit and read through a series of verses that lay out, and that's the reason I mentioned the weight. They would lay out in the verses gluttony, lust, all the things in those passages. They would then zero in on homosexuality, fornication, murder. But I don't think I ever in 20 plus years heard them zero in on the word gluttony, because that would hit close to home. And so, yes, there's that deflection. And then you can also go a step deeper and say there's probably also some repression in a lot of these stories too. But that's a whole nother thing. But that's what I mean is, like, when I say reactionary, I think that it was, what do they believe? I believe the opposite. And I think the larger conversation I think people need to have now is, when people leave those fundamentalist environments, they tend to do the same thing because they have that same operating system. They go, everything the IFB taught, now I believe the opposite. And that's not really a healthy way either. Reactionary living is never helpful. You need to be intentional with how you make decisions, how you receive information, how you process it, and how you apply it, or else you're still living essentially like a fundamentalist.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah, just because you leave fundamentalism doesn't mean fundamentalism leaves you. And
You've been doing this for 2 years. I'm sure you've seen it in the advocacy world. There's people that are
I've been seeing it a lot lately
hardcore.
too. Ooh,
Yeah.
yes. But yeah, I think that was how I was when I got out. Let's believe the opposite of this. And now I've mellowed out a lot more, and I'm on my own deconstruction exploration journey. So you covered the reactionary stuff. Something I want to dig more into is Jack Hyles, because I know he is such a big part of that movement. And, my parents, they went to his college, they were in his church, they heard his sermons. My dad has kept so many tapes of his. He's always loved Jack Hyles. So I want to hear more about Jack Hyles, and more specifically, like, the behaviors and characteristics that IFB pastors have in common, because I've noticed a lot of pastors just copy each other, and a lot of them seem to just copy Jack Hyles. And
Yeah.
so, really, what are characteristics and behaviors of him and his preaching style and in his life that is also common throughout different a lot? I'm not going to say all. I'm just going to say a lot of IFB preachers.
No, the IFB is very parasitic to itself. And so you'll see a lot of pastors that copy, whether it's Jack Hyles, because again, someone listening to this who's in the IFB will go, well, we didn't even talk about Jack Hyles. Okay, the influence was there. I guarantee it. It's somewhere in your IFB church in just the structure of the service. But even taking that away, every IFB pastor who attended an IFB Bible college tends to copy whoever the main name in their circle or their camp was. So you have people that copy Jack Hyles. There's a lot of those. There's a lot of pastors that legitimately speak with like that preacher voice, which is like very much that it's like a Southern accent ish voice, but they're not even from the South. I mean, I was just talking with a friend who went to West Coast Baptist College, and every sermon, 3 points in a poem. There's a perfect structure to every sermon. But Jack Kyle specifically influenced probably the most the cadence with which he spoke, that kind of not breathy, but very like repetitive kind of, you're going to go do this and they say this and they do this, like where you're building people. And there's a reason he is very listenable to as a speaker is he does take you on this. If you let him, he takes you on this very kind of emotional, like stirring kind of journey through his messages because he says very simple things, very repetitively and very memorably. So he'll say, the Catholic Church with their this and their this will never do this. So we have to. And if you are just on autopilot and you're following along, you start going, yeah, you start getting brought into that cadence. The same way politicians do that stuff where it says they say we're not going to do this, but we're going to do that. It's this very easy to hear, very digestible style of speaking that honestly, politics aside, is very much the reason I think that a Donald Trump felt familiar to evangelical voters because they heard that kind of cadence very regularly. But Jack Hyles, one of the interesting things that was copied was not just his sermon structure and not even just how he spoke, but Jack Hyles would always clear his throat. So he would always say, the blah, 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 like he would do that all the time. And there was a lot of people, and this was stories that I heard from my pastor growing up, but he was like, there were people who went to that college who heard him speak, who when they would speak would also add in these like these voice clearings every time they talked about a point because that's what Hyles did. And a lot of pastors even did this, and there's IFB pastors that would talk about this. They would buy the same style of shirt that Hyles wore. They would wear the same pen or the same lapel or buy the same brand of suit. And so it was looking to him as, okay, whatever he does is clearly working. Let's copy all that and hope that one of those things we do is right. Maybe it is the shirts, And Hyles was huge on shirts. There's a sermon clip I heard one time where he's like telling people exactly the brand and the style. And if you give me a shirt that's not that, I'm not going to wear it. He's very much, it was, how do we copy this aesthetic and transplant it to our church? And even the churches that are not Hyles churches, which do exist, have inherited things like the bus ministry, have inherited things like the sermon outlines and the style. And they have really gotten into this kind of formula for how an IFB church should operate. The last thing I'll say about that is even Hyles' son-in-law, Jack Scott, who came later, really dug deep into the formula side to where, a friend of mine was sharing with me that the way that Scott organized the auditorium when they remodeled was to have the floor slanting downward so people got to the altar to make decisions faster, but also walked slower back so they could extend their decision time. Even things like that were planned, meticulous, and thought out. The mimicking was a huge piece of that puzzle.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that because that was something that I was really curious about because as I've gotten out and as I've read like your Substack and everything you post, I was like, oh, well, my pastor did this and this. you're so isolated in that world, you don't always recognize it. And, you're not supposed to question it at all.
One of the other things that was like super popular, and it's become kind of a joke in that world and outside of it, is the alliteration is so huge. So many pastors copy where, the first letter of every point needs to be exactly the same. So the joke at West Coast and Lancaster Baptist Church was always like with John Getch, who was one of their, I think he was over their evangelism teaching, or he was an evangelist under them, but they would say he could alliterate the alphabet, like everything starts with the same letter. They'll have 3 points and it'll be a supreme calling, a spiritual gift, ace, and then some other S. And they'll like always package it in that way. But again, that's just another like quirky thing that like they all do just because that's how everybody does it. But the funny thing is, with how many decades now of preaching there's been, and with pastors, I was listening to a pastor recently who's been pastoring for 50 years. And I was like, I feel like if you're preaching 3 times a week for 50 years, you'd get good at it and get good at speaking. Because I know I, as a speaker, have gotten significantly better since 2020, and I'm still not great, but the progression is there. And I feel like if you're a pastor who is public speaking for an hour 3 times a week, your speaking skills would improve, but so many are still horrible speakers and I'll never understand it. But hey, they've got their 3-point outline. So it's something.
Yeah, no, I have a piece of paper here, so I'm gonna write down things I think of it so I won't
Yeah.
forget. But as you were talking about it, and something I've realized as I've gotten out is that they focus so much on the outward appearance, all about being different, that religious superiority, which is such a big part of the IFB. Like we're so much better than everyone because we follow all these different rules. But that's something I realized as I've gotten out is, they really focused a lot on how we look than necessarily how we treat people. We love people, and even the own word love, I feel like love is twisted a lot in that environment. Love in that environment is telling people they're going to hell. But anyways, I don't know
Yeah.
if you wanted to say anything to that.
Yeah. Yeah. Individuality was a threat in those worlds, even for myself. So you mentioned earlier, there's 2 types of people. There's people where there was like the sudden everything fell apart. This house of cards fell apart. And then there's people where it's like kind of a slow process. For me, fundamentalism worked for me for a long time. Like fundamentalism made sense to me. It was safe. It was comfortable. It was routine. It was easy. And then I've talked about it before. I saw something happen firsthand that didn't jive with what I had been taught, and the whole thing fell apart very quickly. But up until that point, I really drank the Kool-Aid in the system, for lack of a better word. Like I was bought in, I believed it was right. But even as bought in as I was, and as committed as I was, the sparks of individuality were often addressed as being negative. And so when I wanted to go to a Bible college that had a media program, because I was more interested in video, videography and cameras than I was in becoming a preacher, that was stifled quite a bit by a lot of people to say, well, you can keep making videos for the church, but eventually you need to go to Bible college and go to the Bible classes and consider like where you're going to be a youth pastor or a pastor. And so those conversations were there where it's like, hey, you still need to do our plan for you. Like you still need to take our path. And so the individuality was always treated as a threat. And they would still ingest the resources you could provide. If you're a wealthy businessman, they'll still take the donation. If you can create videos, they're still going to use those for Sunday services. But eventually in the pipeline, you need to start heading the direction we need you to, especially if you're a kid. Like we need to start molding you into the next generation of leaders. So it's something that it was frustrating to me within that environment, but it was always something that I was like, well, that's what it has to be. That's kind of the path that I have to take. But individuality in general was just always, if you're different or we can't make sense of you, it's a big problem.
Oh yeah, most definitely. You're supposed to dedicate your life to it. They have the answer. This is your purpose. Why would you ever want to do anything else? And it's portrayed as so holy and sacrificial. And I remember growing up, like the pressure to commit your life to full-time ministry. There was so much pressure. especially sorry for the men. It was sorry for the
Yeah.
women. Be a humble, meekly, quiet wife who's going to find the pastor to marry,
Yeah.
and you're going to become his pianist and do all this stuff and be the homemaker, anyways, all that
Yeah.
stuff. But yeah,
Yeah.
no,
Well, that was, I don't know if you heard this phrase growing up, but I always heard girls told, like, hey, you need to go to Bible college to get your MRS degree. It was always like the joke. And, yeah, I mean, basically the two options if you're a woman it was you can get your secretarial degree or you can get your Christian education degree. So you can be a teacher, you can be a secretary. And then the added layer to that is once you do get a job, you're going to get paid half as much as your husband for doing the same amount of work. And some churches, you'll even be free labor that just comes as a package deal with them. But they don't really put that on a college brochure, but that's typically what happens after you graduate. So,
it's sadly so accurate in that world, and just again like that individuality that you're not allowed to have. And it's been interesting because I've recently started watching The Handmaid's Tale actually this week, and I've been just looking at it and thinking about the IFB, thinking about Bob Jones, and I'm like, oh yeah, there's a lot of similarities, like in, patriarchal teachings and ideology. And I think also something that, again, don't want to get into politics, what you said, but like with Trump, make America great again, there's this going back to the past. And that is something that is so common in fundamentalism of going back. There's this idea, and I think it's like this 1950s era of this just white American family. The husband worked, the woman was at home, and like that they want to hold on to this very simplistic,
yeah.
where again, difference wasn't really recognized in that
Mhm.
time.
Yeah. Well,
Human rights weren't as advanced in America as they are now, and a lot of people don't like that, unfortunately. And it's just this idea of going back, and if we don't go back, horrible things are going to happen.
there's a huge link between the Make America Great Again kind of terminology and the give me that old time religion kind of terminology. Like those two things very much link up hand in hand. And I think, as much as I don't like to get sidelined in political discussion and debate because it never goes anywhere productive almost ever, I think it's important to recognize that these are not new ideas. It's not new styles of politics. Like it is a intentional appealing to the demographic that I think most people do ignore that exist in the country, which are people that do feel like the world has in many ways passed them by and has left the familiarity of their religion, their upbringing, their belief system in the dust. And I think if you do recognize that, you can understand why a figure like Trump can get elected. Because I think he spoke to those people that do feel, rightly or wrongly, left behind by a progressive world, that they do want to go back to a more rigid fundamentalist version of what that looks like. And, I think the deeper discussion on that obviously is engaging with the world in an empathetic way. How do you bring those people forward with you in a way that doesn't make them feel abandoned by culture while also not pushing them deeper down that rabbit hole to where there's a reactionary movement again that leads you back to this ideological dark age of, hey, let me, the world's going this way, let me go as hard as I can the other direction, which I think is what we've seen in the last couple of years. But that's all I'll say about politics on that. But I think it is, the more you understand, I think, fundamentalism, the more you understand that the message of I would say the far right at this point, because I think there's some nuance between right and left in a general sense, but I think the far right perspective, I think if you understand fundamentalism, you understand the appeal and draw of that message and the way it was presented over the last couple of years.
Gotcha. Okay. Something else I wanted to get into was also influential leaders in the past and the present. Could you quickly do an overview of those leaders?
Yeah. Yeah. So the biggest thing I always say is like the reason it's hard, I think, for journalists or like documentarians or whoever to break down the movement, which I was so happy with Let Us Pray that they got it right in the way that they explained it, is that most religious structures are kind of top down in like a pyramid. So you've got the Catholic Church as the Pope, and then you've got the other Catholic, you have the bishops and all, like, and I'm not going to try to get all that order right, but you've got very clear central authority, then you have little tiny
Yeah, a
popes basically
hierarchy.
all the way down.
Hmm.
And the IFB in many ways functions in circles, which is who is in my orbit within this group of churches. And so, there's not a pope of the IFB, but I would say each circle tends to have its own little pope. And so when you go into, like we mentioned, Hiles, like Jack Hiles was kind of the pope of the IFB at large for a minute, but he had his circle around Indiana, Chicago, like his region. You have, Bob Jones, who was, and I'm sure you've probably gotten this, he's tangential to the IFB movement. He was always kind of a figure that was around, but not in. But he was enough in that IFB churches saw them as a valid option for people to go to college. So I would say he was in the circle of the IFB. Again, people can fight me on it. I don't care. I'm not going to get in a comment war with somebody about it. But, Bob Jones had his circle of loyalists. The Hortons with the Becca curriculum and Pensacola Christian College had their own kind of group of people. That college was kind of the leader. So, like, I would say the Hortons with Abeka was much more of an influence than, say, who was running the campus church at the time. You've got the Ruckmans, who I know we talked about before we hit record, he had a cult unto himself that was very small. He had very little major mainstream influence, at least out loud, but he had a lot of influence on kind of the weird subsects of the IFB. And then you had more recently in Southern California, you had, and this would be 1972, I believe, you had Jack Treber, who was a Hiles devotee who started Golden State Baptist College. He had his own circle. Later on, Paul Chappell with West Coast Baptist College had his own circle. He's really built a little empire in the dirt kind of thing out in Lancaster that has influenced a lot of people in Southern California and the more loose fundamentalists that are scattered around the country. And so those are some of the key names, but I would say again, if you want to know a lot about what the core teaching of your specific IFB church is, if you know where your Baptist pastor went to college, you'll probably start seeing similarities to other churches that are, if you take this string, I'm just making weird motions, but if you take a string from like a Bob Jones to their church, you'll start seeing Bob Jones theology in that church. Or if you see Hiles Anderson, you're going to see a string go out to this church in Kentucky that the pastor went there, and so he copied it. So there's a lot of big names. In Florida, Bob Gray was a big name for a long time until he was arrested for sexual abuse of a minor. Surprise, but there's lots of different pieces. But I would say there was like 5 or 6 really strong. And I would say like Hiles, John R. Rice was a big name for a long time. You start getting into the Sword of the Lord with Curtis Hudson that had major influence. But it was just camps within camps. And ultimately they were all the same. They just
Yeah.
had their like territory
Yeah.
within it, which makes it extremely hard to track at times because they're independent when it's convenient and they're united when it's not. And it's a tricky thing to kind of shine a light on because, like cockroaches, when you shine a light on it, they all start scattering and go, we're independent. I'm not connected to Hiles. I'm not connected to BJU, when at the end of the day, they all go to the same conferences and read the same books.
I love that imagery. That was perfect. But I think another name that I've been hearing too is Lester Roloff. What do you know about him?
Lester Roloff is another guy that was, I don't want to say he's fringe because I think that dilutes too much his impact. I say he's fringe in terms of in the circles, he kind of fluttered around all of them. He was a figure that really through the 70s was a huge name in terms of conversation. So he was out of Texas and he ran several what are called troubled teen homes. And those have been exposed a lot lately. If you want to dig into the troubled teen world, Unsilenced is a nonprofit that does a lot of work talking about this. Paris Hilton's documentary, I Am Paris, goes into this world quite a bit. I've done a lot of episodes. Let Us Pray, the documentary covers it. So there's a lot of different deep dives. And I think there's one now called The Program on Netflix, which I haven't gotten a chance to watch yet because I don't have Netflix and I need to get it set up so I can watch it. But I hear that's really good. And a lot of people I love and trust have said it's great. So there's a lot you can dive into. But Roloff was very much a figure who established himself as like the voice for change for troubled teens. And so he started these unlicensed girls' homes and boys' homes where people were essentially presented with, do you want your child to end up dead or in jail, or do you want to send them to my organization? The problem is when you're dealing with extremely sheltered fundamentalist houses, you would see kids sent for anything from, my kid snuck out and went to the movies, I'm going to send them off to a troubled teen home because they're rebellious. At that same home, you have kids who are legitimately in need of major help, whether it is it's an undiagnosed mental disorder that the parents can't deal with, and they look to this unlicensed home with no medical professionals to send their kid to, which again is not a good idea for anybody. But you're putting the kid who really is a good kid with another kid who's really a good kid but needs legitimate help from physicians and maybe a psychologist, and you're putting them in the same bubble. And then you're getting another parent who's going, my kid joined a gang and I think he's going to kill somebody. Then you're sending them there. And then you've got this boys' home of 8-year-old or 9-year-old who got in trouble at school a couple times, to gang adjacent person, to person with a undiagnosed mental health issue that needs to be addressed in an actual medical setting. And you're putting them all in this big box with 60 other kids who all come from variations of the same thing. And then the staff is just church folk that hope they can fix it by having chapel. Like, it's not a safe environment. And ultimately, what you'll see, and I've talked to former staff who've confirmed this, former students, you'd have kids go in who didn't know anything about drugs, who would leave with more knowledge of gangs and drugs after they left, because they're in an environment where basically it's like an unregulated juvenile detention center with a mix of bunch of different kids. But on top of that, the way that you're punishing the kids, who some of them, again, don't even need to be punished, they just need help. Like, you're seeing kids where it's like they're being forced fed, they're being starved. In other cases, they're being not allowed to bathe, not allowed to talk, not allowed to do anything but outside work. They're getting water measured and how much they can have a day. They're getting horrific abuses, physical abuses that are happening all within the structure of these troubled teen homes. And Lester Roloff is at the heart of really Christianizing that movement. The origins of the troubled teen industry really go back to a group called Synanon, which started in Southern California. That was very much, I think it was founded by someone, and this is where I could be incorrect, and I default to all the people who know more than me. I believe it was started by the same person who had a lot of influence on the beginning of AA, which is a whole nother rabbit trail. But Synanon was very much like a cult-like group, where it was a place that looked like a troubled teen kind of approach, which is, we're going to help you get rid of all the things that you're struggling with. And so Roloff kind of took the troubled teen approach and Christianized it, inserted chapel services, music. He would take girls from the homes, travel church to church, and have them sing, collect donations. And, the reasons Roloff became such a big voice in the 70s is because it got all the way to the Supreme Court as to whether these homes should be allowed to operate. And he actually won in court and was allowed to keep open under the freedom of religion. He was allowed to keep open these girls' homes and these boys' homes. And there's, tons of articles that I have and newspaper cutouts that I have from that time period. But ever since Roloff, there's been many imitators. There's many people influenced, many who worship him still, who have done similar homes. And it's really, when I started Preacher Boys, I didn't know what an issue these homes were. And now I'm realizing how many thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, have been influenced by homes like Roloff's and many others. I know that's a lot, but any of these guys, you can start going down this trail of scandals and issues and abuses, and it feels like you're only scratching the surface. Like, Roloff is responsible for a lot of really horrific things, both directly and indirectly through the methods that he taught. But at the end of the day, having an unlicensed, unregistered children's home that is caring for minors who are, quote unquote, acting out for a variety of reasons, many of which were abused themselves, and that's why they were acting out, and their abusive parent is shipping off. There's so many variables, and none of them, I've never heard a story where I'm like, yeah, it sounded like you needed to be taken from your home and sent to an unregulated prison for a year, or 6 years, or however long they're there.
Mm. Yeah, no, thank you for going in depth into that because it is something that needs to be exposed and there are different variables that go into it. And one other variable that I've really realized recently is that I've thought about is a lot of these fundamentalist parents are so concerned about their reputation that they're just, the Duggars did this with, Josh. Oh, send him away here. We don't want him around until he's like behaving the right way, which again, like that didn't work for him at all. And again, the parents are so concerned about their reputation. Oh, let's get them to break this child down. And also with Lester Roloff, using a typical IFB tactic of instilling so much fear of, oh, your child is going to go down this slippery slope with this horrible path. Send them to my home. I have the answer for you. You don't have to be worried about that. And again, like in the IFB, you're never supposed to get legitimate help. Like they cause you to distrust, especially I always heard about don't trust a therapist, don't trust a psychologist.
Yeah.
They cannot help you. We have the answer. This is the only way. So it's really scary when that becomes the answer for everything, but
Yeah.
it's really not. And you
Yeah.
have to fit into that system.
Yeah. I mean, physical labor is not the catch-all, like punishment and rehabilitation, And so in Josh Duggar, to be specific, like there's an IFB connection there where he went to a Reformers Unanimous headquarters, basically, which is an IFB rehabilitation group for people that struggle with addictions of various kinds. Again, totally unqualified to offer any advice in that area, but they exist in many different churches. And I mean, Josh Duggar essentially went and dug some holes and heard some sermons and was labeled good to go. And Reformers Unanimous, I mean, was very unhelpful in that situation, clearly. But also, the leadership of Reformers Unanimous has been under major scrutiny in the last year because of covering up sexual abuse cases. So, the former director of Reformers Unanimous, Paul Kingsbury, which people can Google that name for more details. I mean, he's covered for a rapist. He was literally just there at his church a couple days ago. He resigned for mishandling, I think it was like 30 plus abuse cases. So again, when you start shining the light, you start seeing how many of these guys are connected in gross ways. And it starts making sense why a Josh Duggar wasn't helped by an organization that's run by guys who are friendly to things like what Josh Duggar did. It's a really disturbing, gross web of connections.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. That it is interesting to see these connections because I'm going to interview a Bob Jones survivor who went to Paul Kingsbury Church. I knew nothing about Paul. I knew nothing about his church, but I was reading articles about it and I was like, his church founded RU and he's a part of that? Because my IFB church cult had a Reformers Unanimous chapter. They would meet, they always announced in the pulpit, RU is meeting on this and such time. We need volunteers to, and growing up on Reformers Unanimous, I was like, that's strange.
Yeah.
But now I'm just like, oh my gosh, like all the
Yeah.
different things are connected. And as
Yeah.
you know, you found
Kingsbury's a
out.
big story. Yeah, definitely keep digging in because there's a lot. There's a
I
lot
am
there.
digging. Yeah, I'm definitely going to cover it on this podcast, probably later in this season. But it's just something I'm like, oh, I keep going down all these different like rabbit holes of different things, and it's been fun, and I'm excited to expose it. But yes, thank you for going in depth with the teen homes. I love when we go down these different areas still. But something I wanted to move on to within the IFB is really how does the IFB handle sexual abuse?
Well, it's interesting you're asking me that today because right before I got on this interview, there was a story that happened in North Valley Baptist Church in Santa Clara, California. And I covered the story of sexual abuse by a youth pastor who's related to the head pastor, Jack Trieber, who I mentioned. This youth pastor had sexually assaulted, over the course of several months, 2 women within the church. And one of them, both were minors. One of them, he sexually abused. The other, he sexually abused, and she actually became pregnant with his child. And the pastor of the church, Jack Trieber, arranged for one of the girls the girl who got pregnant, to go off and live in a different state with different families so nobody in the church would be aware of it, arranged for the child to be adopted, and also arranged for his brother-in-law to go move to another state and attend another IFB church there, where, of course, the brother-in-law got caught doing something there as well. And so that's kind of what happens. There's a lot. I don't want to even, there's a lot of it. And people will argue there's not as much as this, or there's, first of all, if the argument is we abuse everyone just as much as everyone else, it's not a great sign of success, because you're claiming to be morally superior in every category. If your argument is we don't do it as much as the Catholic Church, congratulations, I can't hit a baseball as well as a Major League Baseball player. Like, you're comparing yourself to historically a horrific group. Although statistically, I've done the math with people before, it seems like there's not too much difference in the percentage of people that are abusing in terms of clergy. But I don't care to debate the numbers. There's a lot, and I can tell you so many stories. I've done 280 plus episodes covering these stories, and there's lots more to cover. But that story of Trieber and the way he handled it with shipping one off, shipping the victim here, hush, is exactly what happens all the time in these churches. Someone gets caught. The girl who was victimized is treated as a accomplice to the crime itself. It's not reported to law enforcement 9 times out of 10. Faith Baptist Wildemar literally has in their rule to go to the church before going to law enforcement, and the church will decide if it goes to law enforcement. That was in their written rule book for the church and the school. And then the girl is going to be shipped off somewhere, sometimes to a troubled teen home if she's been abused. The abuser is going to be given either another position in another church or just shipped off to go be rehabilitated somewhere. And then what happened literally last night before we recorded this is Jack Trieber was doing his sermon on Wednesday night. They cut the live stream off, and he announced from the pulpit that, this case has been settled. We had to settle because it would destroy our church financially, but don't believe the rumors that you've heard. And it's like the brazenness of a pastor to stand in the pulpit and say, we're not admitting to anything. We're only settling this because, it would destroy our church financially. It's for the greater good. Don't believe the rumors. When there's literally a child that is proven, there's provable documents that show that's not true. But pastors know that their members are not going to dig deeper into these stories. The truth that he says, the version of truth that he says in the pulpit, is the truth for everyone in that auditorium. And nobody else is going to dig deeper than pastor said it's fine. So I would say with every case you see, girl blamed, guy forgiven, offered a lot of grace, quickly back in ministry most times, cover up and denial by the pastor, and refusal to accept any responsibility. And that's what's been repeated over and over again in a million different ways that we could spend 300, 400 episodes talking about.
Yeah, most definitely. And it is scary how much power the pastor holds over their members, because, they put themselves up as representatives of God, and then they claim to be called by God. And so in a sense, like, and I heard it growing up, like, oh, I feel the Lord has put in my heart, the Lord has said to me, so once God said, oh, this is God saying
they're
this.
the man of God, like I always hear the term man of God. And I'm like, if you remove the first 2 words in that phrase, you're pretty close to what it actually looks like in the church. It is, the line between God said and pastor said is extremely blurred.
Yeah, most definitely. And and I had said this in a previous episode I recorded, but when you make something sacred, like, you make it unquestionable. Oh, this is God. This is you. And then automatically, like, you just shut down your critical thinking. And I think too, there's so much loyalty to the pastor, and so many people's identities rest on that. And that's what I've noticed with Bob Jones Sr., as I've called out Bob Jones University, is like so many people look up to him so much, and even just the university putting their identity in that. It's once you start to critique that or expose that, like, people get really fucking pissed. They get really upset.
Well, it shows the lack of weight of the theology itself, to where you need a figure to be spotless, to be the origin that you point to. And I think that, you see this in various organizations. You see this in Hollywood, you see this in church, you see this in politics, is we need that person to be pure. We need that mythology to be true, and it's such a gross thing. I think about this in terms of the story. I haven't watched the series yet, but I know I've been reading about like the Drake Bell allegations against the Nickelodeon coach. And And obviously, there's been many against Dan Schneider who founds Nickelodeon, which I've gone deep down that rabbit hole and just my personal consumption of information. And I've interviewed actresses who worked with Harvey Weinstein. I mean, I know when you see in Hollywood the people that are afraid to get into these cases or to dispel the magic around a Woody Allen, a Roman Polanski, a fill in the blank, a Harvey Weinstein, because it'll affect the magic of Hollywood. And if you start digging deep into, well, I love that show growing up, I don't want to know this thing, or I love these movies. Like, I love movies more than anybody, and I can love that and love the magic of movies and Hollywood while also knowing there's some really messed up stuff that happened, and those guys have to have no power in this conversation. Like, I enjoy a lot of movies that Harvey Weinstein produced, but he's not the reason I love those movies. And I will never be a Harvey Weinstein apologist. Let me categorically say I do not support Harvey Weinstein. But for some reason in churches, there's the same thing that you see in Hollywood, which is the magic of the church is going to be tainted if we say that our Harvey Weinsteins, our pastor Weinsteins, for lack of a better word, are blameless. If we say that they're involved in a scandal, that's going to affect our brand. And to me, that's such a weird thing when you're saying you have this holy text, you have this spiritual, reality that you live in. Why do you need this guy so badly? Like, why do you need this rapist so badly to make your religion work? Because it seems if you have all of this higher than earth authority that's given to you by God, you could easily say, he was not one of us, mark him, avoid him, and let's move forward. We don't need him. He's a mortal human being in the scheme of a eternal power that we're tapped into. But I think it really shows like how much reliance they have on the pragmatism of a Jack Hyles or a Bob Jones or a fill in the blank with a billion different people. And so you tie yourself into a pretzel basically trying to explain the sordid history of your religion, much like many apologists for the pure Hollywood magic side of things go, well, Woody Allen didn't really do anything that bad. Like you start going down that same kind of rabbit hole.
Yeah, thank you so much for explaining that. And I know we're getting closer to the end of our time, so I'm hoping to get through the other questions, which I've been really excited about. So my next question is, so you were in the docuseries Let Us Pray, which covered sexual abuse in the IFB. What were your thoughts on the docuseries once you saw the final product?
To echo, and just I want to say it, we were in the top 7 on Max documentaries, right next to Selena Gomez's cooking show. So and Megan Thee Stallion. So, and I'm a fan of both those people, so that's great. We're up there. It's me and them right in the top. Now, yeah, when I watch, so a few days before Let Us Pray aired, so for people to have context, like the series, people began working on the series in 2019 in terms of research, pre-production stuff. In 2020, I was reached out to by the production company and started having all these conversations. 2021, we went in, I think we had a couple more conversations. And then like around 2022, we started going and doing actual filming. They had been filming with other people before that. So it was a 4-year-ish process putting the series together. And those, like there was a lot of nervousness. Like I was getting filmed, interviewed, and I knew many other people that were being filmed and interviewed. And so there was a lot of things of, I hope they get this right. I hope this works. I haven't seen anything. And right before it came out, 2 days before, I was talking to someone else who's featured in it. And she was like, what if it sucks? And I was like, I know, I think the same thing. What if, these people are great that we've been working with, but we've all seen the boring true crime documentary or the thing that we feel like misses the point, or as much as we had faith in it, you just are human. So you start questioning, is it going to be okay? Immediately after watching both parts of it, I mean, I was blown away by it. And I texted the director after, and I just said, it felt validating seeing the way that it was put together. It felt much like you said at the beginning of this, like it feels validating to see it presented in a way by a filmmaker who had no context for it before they started the project, to see the things that we've been saying. And it also felt incredibly powerful to see people that I know who have shared a lot of them had shared their story on my show, but to see, a Rachel Peach, or to see an April Avila or a Kathy Durbin, who I had interviewed, all of those, or to see Ruthie, who I interviewed during the course of the documentary, to see them not only get to be on like a podcast and talk about their story, which is great, but also to see them get on Investigation Discovery to what I can imagine is a lot more people than what my podcast reaches, to HBO Max, to be seen on a very public level was incredible. And to see them, I didn't get to be there when they were filmed. So like to get to see what they said and their story and the way that it was told, the director of the series was Academy Award shortlisted and Emmy winning director. So I knew it would be good. I didn't realize just how good and how well she was going to tell those stories. And so my takeaway from it is there more that could have been added? 100%. There could be 30 seasons and I would watch all of them. But I also think as the documentary stands, there's nothing I would change about it. I think it is a great, I know I'm biased, but truly looking at it as a third party, I think it's one of the best documentaries on the topic that exists. And I think it does a perfect job of remembering the humanity of the people who've been affected, instead of just focusing on the headlines, the scary tragedy, and the disturbing elements. Because I think that's where most of these stories fall short. It focuses on what happened to the people and not who those people are. And I think that the series does a good job, especially in that final episode with Ruthie in court saying, what she represents and what this moment represents. I think it's really beautiful. And so I'm really happy to say I'm proud of it. And I'm so thankful I was able to be a part of it. And I hope there's more. And I hope that they, whether that's with a whole new group of people, whether it's with the same, I hope they keep pulling on that thread.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like when I watched it in, I think, was it 1 or 2 sittings? Anyways, I had whiskey and I watched with an IFB friend. I'm like, let's do this. We're gonna get through this. And oh my gosh, and it brought back a lot of memories too, especially with just the validation of just all the control that happens in the IFB, and just really, and I think it Ruth. I think someone said something about brainwashing. I was like, yeah, like they want to wash the junk out of your brain. That's what they, and like some of them will even explicitly say, oh, our brains do need to be washed. Our brains do need this. Obviously, First Baptist of Hammond had to be in there, and Jack Hyles. I was hoping they would have done a little bit more into that, but I know they can only do so much throughout that series.
David Hyles himself could be a series unto himself. How many scandals over the years. So yeah, there's plenty there they could have
so much
dove into.
And it was really wild to me because when they talked about the goldfish, I remember my dad telling me growing up when he went to Hyles Interstate, yeah, we would swallow goldfish on the bus. And as a child, I thought he meant like the crackers goldfish. Yeah. And so when I see the clips of them swallowing real live goldfish, I was like, oh my God. Like,
you never did that?
So my dad did do that. Yes.
I got asked to do it all the time because we do it every summer at our church. And I was
interesting.
That was the one thing I was like, I'm not faithful enough to do this.
Interesting. Yeah.
One year they ate worms too. But bus ministries did a lot of stuff like that. Like the most tame version, which I think is fine, was like, if you guys bring enough friends, we'll let you pie the bus worker in the face. Okay, that's pretty normal. That's cute. One year they shaved someone's head, I think. But there was also like, yeah, we're going to swallow a live goldfish if you bring this many. Or one year they did worms, I remember. And then I've heard other churches where like they built like a big explosive that they set off at the church, which like there's just all kinds of weird gimmicks to get people in. But yeah, the goldfish thing was like a yearly thing for a minute at ours. But I was always like one year they were really mad. They're like, you got to do it. I was like, I'll do anything for this church, but not that. Allow me to be martyred first before I swallow a live goldfish.
Yeah, no, it's so gross. And I'm really curious, what has been the IFB's reaction to the Let Us Pray series?
Denial, cover up. A lot of just offhanded remarks. All expected. I think largely it was ignore it, wait for it to go away. Some pastors have preached sermons where they've mentioned it, but it's just denial and rejecting that as the truth and continuing to propagate their version of events. And so that becomes trickier, I think, for them to do effectively. when there's legitimately people behind bars and lawsuits won. People have called into credibility the women in the series, and it's, well, I mean, just Faith Baptist Wildemar, for example, like, all of their abusers have gone to prison, and all of them have also won lawsuits against the church. So if you're waiting for innocent until proven guilty, that's happened. So, like, at this point, you're just living in denial, which is kind of the default state of fundamentalists in general, is sort of living in a state of denial.
Yeah, I think that does sum it up pretty well. And the next question I want to get into is, I'm not sure if you're how much you're able to answer of it, but I'm really curious about what you can say. But so First Baptist Church of Hammond was featured in the docuseries, as it should have been. And I know you had a conversation with John Wilkerson. He is a current pastor of First Baptist. Can you share any takeaways from that conversation?
Yeah, and you can hear my full kind of breakdown of the conversation on the Leaving Eden podcast. And I can link you to a direct link to just that portion if you want to share it in the show notes. But yeah, basically I went to a protest at First Baptist Church, and that was organized by April Avila, and I was there with Kathy Durbin and various people who had in some way been affected by the church. We went to lunch after, and Wilkerson had put out a statement saying, hey, I'm not going to meet with the protesters outside in a public way or have a public dialogue, but I'm happy to meet privately. And I was just like, that's a waste of time. I'm not going to do that. And just fun fact, I actually knew Wilkerson from before he went to First Baptist, because he pastored a church in Long Beach where we used to play basketball against them. So, like, I had met Wilkerson before just in passing, and was very familiar with who he was. But anyway, we were at lunch, and Kathy was like, I want to talk to him. And I was like, Kathy, that's a waste of time. Let's not do that. And so, but I'm leaving tomorrow. He can't say the conversation didn't happen. Let's just do it. So, I went with her into First Baptist Church. We'd like to speak to John Wilkerson. This is 3 hours before the evening service. The secretary points us up to where his office is. Someone's in there. We sit there and wait. And I'm just sitting there going, like, why am I here? What are we doing? And I'm like, Kathy, this is a waste of time. Let's go. Fun side note, I didn't mention this on Leaving Eden exclusive. I did think it was very funny when we walked in that there's a picture of Jack Hyles right. So there's like all the pastors that have pastored the church in framed photos on the wall, except for Jack Scott for some reason. I don't know why. And then Jack Hyles' picture is right by the men's bathroom. And I wanted to take a picture and just say, like, fitting placement. But anyway, we sat down and met with Wilkerson. We went into his office, and in the conversation, basically, right off the bat, Kathy explained who she was and that she had been abused in California. The connection was that their church was very close to First Baptist, and that she'd actually been abused one of the times in a parking lot right outside the church in First Baptist Church of Hammond. So, like, she just shared who she was. She shared that she was in a series that she didn't know if he'd watched or not. He didn't confirm or deny whether he'd seen it, and explained kind of why we were there. And Wilkerson said, I'm so sorry, sweet girl. And I was like, I got to get out of here. I can't do this. I can't do this at all. We talked for a little bit. I told Kathy, I said, I'm probably not going to say anything during the meeting. I said, I just really have no interest in wasting my breath on this conversation, but I'll go to support you. I may say something, I may not. She talked for about probably 15 minutes with him, and then I started getting the urge to start talking, because you start hearing the deflection from him. So his take on the whole thing, summarized, was, I'm responsible for what's happened since I've been here. I can't speak to what's happened, and I frankly don't know what's happened in the past. You guys probably know a lot more than I do. To which I give him some, and I said this in the meeting, but I basically said, you're trying to play two sides of the fence, which is, I don't know what happened in the past, and it's not my job to know. Which, the church is 130 something years old. So, okay, I give you the fact that you're not responsible for what happened in 1922 or 1976. However, you're also pastoring a church where that's a pretty big piece of its history. So I do feel like you owe some statement on it. Much like Bob Jones. Like, whoever becomes the president will have to bear some responsibility for the fact that their institution had segregation till, there's some level there where they have to address it because it's an institutional responsibility. But I said, you want to say that you're not responsible for the past. However, you guys put tons of energy into promoting and thrive, like shouting out, this is our heritage. Your buildings are all named after the speakers from the past. Right behind Wilkerson's head in the meeting was a picture of John R. Rice, who is a past IFB. Like I said, we're surrounded by reminders of the past, but you guys can't address in equal measure the not so good things, which again, I don't fault you for the not so good things because he wasn't there. But now's your chance to say, this is not us. This is what we were. This is where we are now. And this is where we're going. That's a much more respectable place to be. And so during the course of the conversation, we talked about that. And one of the things that I brought up specifically was where they're at now. So again, people can listen to the full conversation and kind of hear, or the full breakdown of the conversation. But I specifically said, hey, you guys are having your pastors conference on March 20th. So in a couple days after we're recording this. At this conference, there's going to be David Gibbs. There's going to be Jack Trieber. There's going to be a few other speakers. And I said, David Gibbs held fundraisers in this church for convicted sex offenders after they were convicted. And there's footage of that online. And there's also been people who've had allegations against them for child abuse that David Gibbs defended on this church property and in nearby hotels. Jack Trieber, his brother-in-law, which I kind of shared his story earlier, got a teen girl pregnant in his church, and Jack Trieber helped cover it up. Jack Trieber is going to be speaking at your church. So I basically said, as much as you want to say you're different, you're still surrounding yourself with the same type of people. And Wilkerson, and I want to say this on the record, Wilkerson said, I didn't know about those stories with Trieber and Gibbs. And I said, well, if you did know, I would hope you'd disinvite Trieber from your event. Now that story's out. Wilkerson has not yet, to my knowledge, disinvited Trieber. But the last thing I said to Wilkerson was essentially verbatim, you cannot use ignorance as a shield. You cannot sit here as the pastor of one of the biggest IFB churches and just say, I don't know about these scandals, when everybody else knows about them. And so he knows about Trieber now. I mean, the story's out. And so the fact that Trieber is still going to be at Wilkerson's conference tells me that it's a lot of lip service to these stories. So anyway, that's summarizing 45 minutes of an excruciatingly dull and painful conversation down. But if you want to hear a full descriptor of it, Leaving Eden podcast, where I'll link to you like an unlisted YouTube video that kind of shares me talking about it. Like, part of me wishes the meeting was recorded, but I also tried to go in with as much good faith as possible. Hope he would actually be open and receptive, but as I expected, he was not. So that was a 10,000-foot view.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being willing to share what you could of that. But yeah, that doesn't surprise me either. And yeah, I mean, he is enabling it and complicit in that with not knowing about those leaders. And I hope he does the right thing. And it's wild to me because didn't he like make a video on social media apologizing about some guy who came at a conference who had long hair or something like that?
Yeah. So they hired a local, I think they were local. They hired a like apologist group that does like creation science, which is a oxymoron, first of all. But no, he had a creation science nonprofit that does these seminars similar to Ken Ham and stuff, where they present like proof of creationism, which again, in the scope of things, I don't care if they do that. That's their theory on things. Great for them. However, what happened was the guy that came from this nonprofit happened to have longer hair. I would say like as long as mine is right now, which is not super long. And then they used a different Bible translation, like a ESV or something. Anyway, Wilkerson basically got a lot of flack from people saying, you had a hippie in your church, all this kind of stuff, because hippies are such a thing in 2024. And he put out a video with literally like sad background music saying, we should have done a better job vetting our guest. I am so sorry that, this happened. It was poor judgment on my part. And it's, bro, where's this energy for sexual abuse victims? Like, you're just saving face with your preacher buddies. Wilkerson just really grossed me out with that clip. Not, I mean, if he was like that with everything, it would just be kind of silly and melodramatic. But the fact that he's like that about long hair in a Bible translation and not like that about sexual abuse really rubbed me the wrong way. And we talked about that in the meeting. Kathy brought that up. Like, you can make a video and statement about that, but you can't make a statement about abuses that have happened in this very church. That's a big issue, to say the least.
Ooh, okay, yeah, thank you for sharing that. Because, yeah, it's just the hypocrisy with it. And yeah, it's just, yeah, anyways. But I know we're getting close to the end of our time. So my next question is, I know you grew up in the IFB. Could you share some of your experiences in the movement and really the core experience that led you to expose it?
Yeah. The short version of this answer, I know I definitely shared very in depth on the Cults to Consciousness podcast recently, where I kind of just dig deep, and also the Indoctrination podcast. I talked about it, which I know you're connected to. Like that, that is one of the best, I think, interviews with me, kind of explaining my background and like the mental side of it, as well as the quirkiness of it. So all those places, if you want more after this, if you're like 2 hours of Eric is not enough, let's get more, there's some options. But my experience was very typical. Like, I grew up, my parents were legitimately pretty great in terms of fundamentalist parents. They allowed me to read books and watch movies. Like, we still had some strict guidelines, but like my mom had a love of literature. So like I was more exposed to normal things than some kids were. Still wasn't allowed to watch Harry Potter and, R-rated movies and all that kind of stuff, but had a relatively balanced way of learning how to think, not what to think, at least in the home. The church itself didn't really teach that. And so, my youth pastor, who was like a second father figure to me in many ways, really pushed aside critical thinking and just was very much interested in molding the next generation of people. And so my experience was very much one where I question things, but I also, my ultimate answer to all questions was that's what God said. So it was kind of I was a free thinker, but there was a lid on it. It's like that old example of, I think it's grasshoppers, or there's some metaphor. I don't even know if it's true or if it's a Facebook thing that people say, but it's basically that, it's fleas. The old post about, if you put fleas on a table, they'll jump this high. If you put them in a jar and you put the lid on, they'll jump this high. And then if you leave them in the jar for a long time and you take the lid off, they'll always jump to the height of the jar. I think that's probably not a true thing, and it's probably just a weird old wives' tale. But I think that's a good metaphor for, I jumped freely within the realm of the box I was in. What shattered the box was seeing a cover up of a sexual abuse case in real time, where a predator was shuffled from the church where the abuse happened to our church. I Googled his name. I found that he had a warrant for his arrest, and the response of the church to that information was that I was bitter for bringing it up, that I wasn't forgiving. And it was a really horrific last 2 years being there that ended up with all of my bridges essentially being burned with people that I had grown up with for, 16 years at that point. So that's the 10,000-foot view of what's obviously a very complicated story, but it's really not that complicated. Like, I saw a church that claimed to be the, city set on a hill, that, the light in the lighthouse, the different church than the Catholics and all the people that actually are going out there and molesting kids and sprinkling babies and wearing pants. It's, once I realized like, oh, we do all the same stuff, it eradicated the idea that we are different. And that was kind of the, if we're not what we say we are, then what are we? And it didn't make it a hard decision to go like, oh, you guys are wrong. Now, broader faith and religion is something I'm still working through, but in terms of the IFB, it was very clear with the responses that like, there's not morality in this movement. And it pushed me to study all those threads of, well, who is Jack Hyles that my pastor talks about? Oh, wow. There's a lot there. Who is Bob Jones that our curriculum's from? Okay, there's a lot there. Who is, fill in the blank, like Ruckman and all those names that started coming up? It became abundantly clear that I was sitting in a movement that was at the very best cultish and at the very worst a straight up cult. So that was kind of my breaking point. I told someone is I don't relate to people who say I gradually figured it out. Like it was like a switch flipped for me where it was like, oh, so you guys are just, I believe this, but you guys were just lying about it. Okay, great, good to know. And then the path after that's pretty long and muddled, but that was my experience in it and outside of it. It was working for me. I accepted all of it until it was clear that it wasn't. And I think that is the one area in which fundamentalism saved me, was in that moment, the black and white thinking I had been taught to have about everything really kicked me into high gear to go, okay, black and white, right and wrong. This is clearly wrong. And so if it's wrong when the Catholics do it, it's wrong when we do it. They're trying to live in the gray here. And so in that one moment, I think fundamentalist ideology and thinking really pushed me over the edge to go, okay, it is a black and white wrong thing in that case. But I think ironically, they had really shot themselves in the foot teaching me to do that and then teaching me to be bold about standing for the truth. I think those two things really put them in a bad position. So
Yeah, I think you're most definitely right about that. I've talked with that, especially with Erin Birchwell. She's, yeah, they trained us, to speak for the
yeah.
truth.
And now
now
they're
we're on that.
surprised.
Yeah, no, there's, yes. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much for coming on Beyond BJU. Where can people find your work at?
Yeah, I mean, the number one place I'd send people to is the Preacher Boys podcast. It's anywhere you listen to shows. It's on YouTube, the Preacher Boys podcast. And if you search that, you'll find all the socials and things. And then the other thing I'd mention is just Let Us Pray, which is streaming on Max. If you have it or anywhere that has Investigation Discovery, you should be able to access the series. It's really good. I'm in it, so I'm biased, but it's really good.
It is
So,
really good. It is so good.
there you go. He's unbiased and he
Yeah,
says
I'm
it's
so
good.
unbiased
So,
too. Yeah.
so there you go. It is really great. It's 4 episodes. It's heavy, but like I always say, like all of these girls in the series experienced it. So who are we to say it's too much to listen to? But I do understand there's people listening to this who probably have experienced similar things. So I would just say it is dealing with sexual abuse. So if you're not ready for that and it's going to be a triggering thing, I mean, watch at your own discretion. If you're just somebody that's, I don't need to waste time hearing it, I think that's the least you could do if you've benefited from or contributed to a system like the IFB. So yeah, that's available on Max. Let Us Pray, A Ministry of Scandals is the name of the series, and it's well worth watching.
Yes. Well, thank you again, Eric, for coming on. And for people listening, I'll link all of his things in the description. Please go listen to his podcast. And oh, yeah, subscribe to his Substack, which is really good. Exposes a lot in that movement. But thank you again, Eric, for coming on Beyond BJU.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond BJU. If you are listening on Apple Podcast or on Spotify, if you could leave a 5-star rating, this will help other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you.